I knew the moment my daughter-in-law pointed at me in the middle of my granddaughter's wedding reception and called me the shame of the family that the night was about to change in ways none of them were prepared for. The music had just softened as guests began gathering near the center of the ballroom, glasses of champagne catching the warm golden light from the chandeliers above. Emma's wedding was supposed to be the happiest day our family had shared in years. I had spent the entire morning reminding myself of that. At 69, I have lived long enough to know that weddings are fragile things, full of emotion and memory and quiet expectations. I arrived at the venue just before 4 o'clock that afternoon, smoothing the skirt of the pale blue dress I had chosen carefully the night before. It was a simple dress, nothing flashy, but my late husband Richard used to say the color made my eyes look younger than they were. I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the small pearl earrings he had given me for our 40th anniversary, whispering to his photograph on the dresser, "Your granddaughter is getting married today." The drive to the venue took about 30 minutes through the quiet suburbs outside Chicago. The sky was clear, the kind of soft early autumn afternoon that makes everything look peaceful and promising. I remember thinking that Richard would have loved this day. Emma had always been his favorite, the little girl who used to sit on his lap and ask endless questions about the world. When I stepped into the reception hall, the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. White roses and eucalyptus lined the long tables, and tall glass candles flickered gently along the aisle leading toward the dance floor. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. For a moment, I simply stood there taking it all in, grateful that our family could gather together again after the difficult years that followed Richard's passing. But even in that first moment, something felt slightly off. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. My son Michael was speaking quietly with Sabrina near the bar, and when he noticed me, he hesitated for half a second before giving a quick wave instead of the warm hug he usually offered. Sabrina's smile looked polished, practiced, the kind of smile people wear when they are performing rather than celebrating. I brushed the thought aside. Weddings make everyone nervous, I told myself. There are schedules to keep, guests to greet, 100 small details that can make people tense. I walked farther into the room, nodding politely to a few relatives and old friends who had already arrived. The band was warming up near the stage, a slow instrumental drifting through the room like a quiet promise of the evening ahead. Then it happened. Sabrina stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she turned toward a small group of guests standing nearby. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "There she is," she said, lifting her hand and pointing directly at me. "The shame of our family." For a second, the entire room seemed to pause. Conversations softened. A few heads turned. Someone near the bar let out an awkward little laugh that quickly faded into silence. I could feel every pair of eyes shifting toward me. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply stood there, holding my small evening clutch in both hands, and smiled politely as if I had just heard an ordinary introduction. Because after 69 years of living, I have learned something important about moments like that. The person who shouts rarely understands the whole story. And that night, in that bright ballroom filled with roses and music and champagne glasses, none of them understood the story yet. I remained standing exactly where I was for several seconds after Sabrina said those words, long enough for the silence in the ballroom to stretch into something thick and uncomfortable. A few people shifted their weight, pretending to examine the floral arrangements or adjust their jackets, but no one spoke. I could hear the soft clink of a glass being set down somewhere behind me and the quiet hum of the air conditioning above the tall windows. I kept my smile in place. The same polite smile I had worn through school recitals, neighborhood dinners, and every family gathering for more than 40 years. My hands were steady, even though I could feel my pulse moving slowly through my wrists. I looked at Sabrina first. She was standing confidently beside the long reception table, her shoulders squared, her expression calm as if she had simply announced the start of the evening's program. Then, I looked at my son. Michael was standing about 10 feet away, near the bar, holding a glass of sparkling water. He was not smiling. He was not speaking either. He simply looked at the floor for a moment before lifting his eyes briefly toward me and then away again. That small movement hurt more than Sabrina's words ever could. A son who disagrees with an accusation will speak. A son who says nothing has already made his choice. I lowered my gaze and adjusted the clasp on my purse, a simple black clutch that Richard bought for me nearly a decade ago when we attended a charity dinner downtown. The memory of that evening came back to me with surprising clarity. Richard had always insisted that I walk into a room with quiet confidence, no matter who was watching. He used to say that dignity was not something other people could give you. It was something you carried yourself. I stepped forward slowly, moving past the small cluster of guests who had gathered near the entrance. Some of them offered hesitant smiles. Others looked away entirely. I did not blame them. Weddings are delicate occasions, and most people do not know how to react when tension enters a room that was meant for celebration. As I walked toward an empty chair near one of the side tables, the band resumed playing softly, a slow instrumental piece meant to fill the space before the dinner service began. The sound floated through the room as if nothing unusual had happened. That is the strange thing about moments of humiliation. The world does not stop. Glasses are still raised. People still talk. Someone across the room laughed at a joke I could not hear. Life simply continues, even while something inside you shifts quietly into place. I sat down carefully, smoothing the fabric of my dress across my knees. From where I was sitting, I could see the large windows that overlooked the garden outside the venue. The sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon, casting long golden light across the lawn where the ceremony had taken place an hour earlier. I remembered watching Emma walk down the aisle that afternoon, her white dress moving softly in the breeze, her smile wide and hopeful. For that moment, I had believed our family was standing together again. I folded my hands in my lap and allowed my breathing to settle into a slow rhythm. Sabrina had expected a reaction. That much was clear. She had expected anger or embarrassment, or perhaps even tears. Instead, she received nothing more than my quiet presence in the room. After a minute or two, conversations gradually resumed around the ballroom. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, offering me a glass of iced tea. I thanked him and took it, the cool condensation forming on the outside of the glass against my palm. As I lifted the glass to my lips, I noticed someone approaching from the far side of the room. The woman moved slowly but deliberately, weaving through the tables until she reached the chair beside mine. When she sat down, I recognized her immediately. Margaret Hale had been Richard's closest friend for more than 30 years, a woman who rarely missed anything important. She did not look at me right away. Instead, she placed her small handbag on the table and watched the room for a moment. Then she leaned slightly closer and spoke in a voice quiet enough that no one else could hear. "Helen," she said gently, "I think there is something happening tonight that you deserve to understand." Margaret did not rush her words, and that alone told me the conversation was serious. She kept her eyes on the ballroom floor where guests were beginning to gather near the tables, while the catering staff quietly prepared for dinner service. For a few seconds, she simply watched the room, as if measuring how much time we had before someone might notice our conversation. Then she turned slightly toward me and spoke again in that same calm, steady voice. "I have been watching Sabrina for the past few weeks," she said. "Something about the way she has been talking to people did not feel right." I kept my gaze forward, looking at the large floral centerpiece in the middle of the table, a tall arrangement of white roses and soft green leaves that smelled faintly sweet in the warm air. From across the room, I could hear Emma laughing with one of her bridesmaids, completely unaware that tension was quietly moving through the reception like a slow shadow. Margaret continued speaking. "She has been telling people a story about you," she said carefully. "A very specific story." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the glass of iced tea resting on the table. The ice cubes shifted gently inside the glass with a soft sound. I did not interrupt her. Margaret was the kind of woman who chose her words with care, and when she decided to speak, it was usually because she believed something important needed to be said. "She has been telling guests that you tried to control the wedding," Margaret explained. "That you argued with the planners, that you criticized the arrangements, that you wanted attention for yourself instead of letting Emma have her moment." I listened quietly, letting the words settle in the space between us. It was a strange experience hearing accusations that described a version of me I did not recognize. I had not spoken to the wedding planner more than once, and that conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes. Emma had chosen nearly everything herself, and I had been proud of the way she handled it. Margaret leaned a little closer and lowered her voice even more. "She also told several people that you refused to help with the wedding expenses," she added. That Michael and Sabrina had to take care of everything because you would not contribute. For the first time since she sat down beside me, I allowed myself to glance directly at her. The look in Margaret's eyes was not one of gossip or curiosity. It was concern. That told me she had not repeated these words lightly. I turned my attention back to the ballroom. The lighting had grown warmer as the sun continued to lower outside the windows. Servers were placing folded napkins beside each plate while the band quietly shifted into a gentle jazz melody. Everything looked elegant, peaceful, almost perfect. It was remarkable how normal a room could appear even while an entirely different story was unfolding beneath the surface. That explains the looks, I said quietly after a moment. My voice sounded calm, almost distant, as if I were discussing someone else's situation instead of my own. Margaret nodded once. I did not believe her, she said firmly. Richard trusted you with everything for a reason. Hearing my husband's name spoken in that room brought a familiar warmth to my chest. Richard had always believed that patience revealed more truth than anger ever could. I had carried that lesson with me through many difficult moments over the years. Margaret rested her hands on the table and studied my face carefully. There is something else you should know, she said after a pause. Earlier this afternoon, I overheard Sabrina speaking with two of Michael's colleagues near the entrance. She told them that she and Michael covered the entire cost of this wedding themselves. Margaret stopped there and allowed the words to settle. I felt a quiet understanding begin to form in the back of my mind. The accusation from earlier, the carefully planted stories, the pointed finger in the center of the room. It had never been about a moment of anger. It had been preparation, a performance designed to shape the way everyone in that ballroom saw me. I lifted my glass again and took a slow sip of iced tea, the cool taste steady and familiar. Across the room, Sabrina was laughing with a group of guests, her posture relaxed and confident, as if she had already won something important. I watched her for a moment, and then set the glass back down on the table. Margaret, I said softly, did she mention where that money came from? Margaret gave a small, knowing smile, the kind of expression that appears when someone realizes the truth is finally beginning to reveal itself. No, she replied gently. But I have a feeling you already know the answer to that question. I did know the answer to that question, although I had not expected to hear it discussed in whispers across a ballroom filled with flowers and music. I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked around the reception hall again, allowing my eyes to move slowly from table to table. Guests were settling into their seats now, while the waitstaff placed bread baskets and small plates of butter along the center of each table. Soft conversation floated through the room, blending with the low rhythm of the band. If someone had walked into the hall at that moment, they would have believed the evening was unfolding perfectly. Weddings are very good at hiding quiet tensions behind polished smiles and carefully arranged decorations. I folded my hands in my lap and considered Margaret's words carefully. Sabrina had been telling people that she and Michael had paid for everything. That meant the story she was building required me to appear selfish, distant, and unhelpful. Without that version of events, the performance from earlier would not have made sense to anyone watching. I remembered the afternoon 3 months earlier when Emma came to visit me at my house. She had arrived with a notebook full of ideas and a bright excitement in her voice as she described the kind of wedding she dreamed about. A garden ceremony, soft music, dinner for close friends and family. Nothing too extravagant, but beautiful in a simple and meaningful way. I could still picture the way she sat at my kitchen table, sunlight falling across the pages of her notebook while she spoke. She had looked nervous when she finally admitted that the budget was larger than she and her fiancé had expected. I had not hesitated even for a second. Richard and I had spent decades building a life that allowed us to help our family when it mattered most. I had simply told her that the wedding should be everything she hoped for and that the financial details would be taken care of quietly. Emma had cried a little then, the way people do when relief arrives faster than they expect. That conversation had been private. Only Emma, myself, and later the family attorney who handled the trust arrangements knew the full details. I had never needed recognition for it. Watching Emma happy had always been enough. Across the room, Sabrina was still speaking confidently with several guests, her hands moving as she described something animatedly. I could see how easily a story might take shape around a person like that. Confidence is a powerful tool when people do not know the full truth. Margaret sat quietly beside me, allowing me time to process everything she had shared. After a moment she spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Helen, I do not think she expected anyone to question the story," she said. I nodded slowly. "No," I replied. "She expected the room to accept it." I glanced toward Michael again. My son was speaking with one of Emma's uncles now, his expression serious, his shoulders slightly tense. I wondered how much of the story he had heard and how much he had chosen not to examine too closely. Sometimes people accept a comfortable explanation simply because it keeps life moving forward without conflict. I picked up my glass again and turned it gently in my hand, watching the ice move through the amber liquid. "There is something interesting about moments like this," I said quietly. Margaret looked at me with curiosity. "What is that?" she asked. I allowed a small, calm smile to return to my face. "The truth does not hurry," I answered. "It simply waits for the right moment to arrive." Margaret studied me for a second, and then she gave a soft nod of understanding. The evening continued around us as servers began bringing the first plates of salad to the tables. Conversations grew louder, laughter returned in small bursts, and the band shifted into a brighter melody. From the outside, the reception looked lively and joyful again. But somewhere beneath the music and polite conversation, a quiet realization had begun to settle inside me. Sabrina believed she had already shaped the story of this evening. What she did not understand, yet, was that stories built on assumptions often collapse the moment real facts appear. And I had a feeling that moment was not very far away. The first course arrived a few minutes later, and the quiet rhythm of dinner service began to settle over the room. Plates were placed carefully in front of each guest. Silverware glinted under the warm light of the chandeliers, and soft conversation gradually filled the spaces between the music. From where I sat I could see nearly the entire ballroom. Emma and her new husband were seated at the head table, smiling politely, while relatives approached to congratulate them. Every few seconds someone lifted a phone to capture another photograph. It looked exactly like the kind of evening every bride hopes for. I picked up my fork and tasted a small bite of the salad in front of me. It was fresh and light, dressed with lemon and olive oil. For a moment, I allowed myself to appreciate the ordinary details of the meal, the gentle hum of voices, the quiet movement of the servers passing between the tables. There was a calm in those small observations that helped keep my thoughts steady. Across the room, Sabrina continued to move confidently from table to table, greeting guests with an ease that suggested she believed the evening was entirely under her control. Every time she laughed, the sound carried just enough for nearby tables to notice. I could see how carefully she positioned herself in the center of conversations, how naturally she guided the attention of the room. Confidence can be very persuasive when no one is looking for another version of the truth. Margaret watched her for a moment and then turned slightly toward me again. "You are very calm," she said quietly. I considered her observation before answering. "Anger makes people careless," I replied. "Careless people reveal less than patient ones." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind that thought. The band began playing a slightly livelier melody as the servers moved through the room, refilling water glasses. The atmosphere was warming again. Laughter rose from several tables as old friends reunited and shared stories. To anyone observing from a distance, the reception had returned to a perfectly comfortable celebration. Yet I could feel the subtle current beneath the surface, the invisible thread of the story Sabrina had woven earlier still stretching through the room. Eventually Sabrina approached our table. She paused beside Margaret's chair first, offering a pleasant greeting before turning her attention toward me. Her smile was polished, controlled, almost professional. "Helen," she said lightly, as if nothing unusual had happened earlier. "I hope you are enjoying the evening." I looked up at her with the same calm expression I had worn since the beginning of dinner. "Emma looks very happy," I answered. That was the truth, and it was the only truth that mattered to me in that moment. Sabrina studied my face for a brief second, perhaps searching for irritation or embarrassment that she could recognize as victory. When she found neither, her smile tightened slightly before returning to its carefully composed shape. "Michael and I worked very hard to make this evening possible," she added, her voice just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Margaret did not react. She simply lifted her glass and took a small sip of water while keeping her eyes on the center of the table. I felt the quiet weight of the statement settle in the air around us. It was another line in the story she was building, another small reinforcement for anyone who might have missed the earlier performance. I placed my fork down gently beside my plate and folded my hands together. Weddings always require a great deal of effort, I said calmly. Sabrina nodded once, satisfied perhaps that the conversation had not turned against her. After a moment she excused herself and continued on to the next table, where another group of guests welcomed her with bright smiles and curious questions about the evening's schedule. When she was several steps away, Margaret leaned closer again. "She is doubling down," she murmured softly. I watched Sabrina cross the room toward the bar, greeting another couple along the way. "Yes," I replied quietly. "That means she believes the story is already finished." Margaret followed my gaze for a moment before looking back at me. "And you?" she asked gently. I allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear at the corner of my mouth. "I believe the story has only just begun." For the next several minutes, dinner continued in the steady, predictable rhythm that large receptions often follow. The salad plates were cleared, warm dinner rolls appeared in small baskets, and the quiet sound of conversation grew stronger as guests relaxed into their seats. I watched the room the way Richard used to watch it during business events, calmly observing the small patterns that reveal more than people intend to show. Sabrina moved easily between groups, laughing, leaning closer to guests when she spoke, occasionally touching Michael's arm as if to reinforce the image of a united couple who had generously organized the entire evening. It was a carefully constructed performance, and I could not deny that she played the role convincingly. Michael remained near the bar for a while before eventually making his way toward the head table again. His shoulders were tight, his smile a little slower than usual. I wondered whether he sensed that the story unfolding around him was not as simple as it appeared. Margaret sat quietly beside me, allowing the moment to breathe. She had known Richard long enough to understand that patience often reveals more truth than confrontation ever could. A few minutes later, the main course arrived. The servers placed neatly arranged plates in front of each guest, grilled chicken with roasted vegetables and a small portion of rice. The scent of herbs filled the air, mixing with the fragrance of roses from the centerpieces. I picked up my fork and ate slowly, allowing the warmth of the food to settle my thoughts. Across the ballroom, the wedding planner stepped onto the small stage near the band and tapped gently on the microphone stand. The soft sound carried across the room, drawing the attention of the guests one table at a time until the conversations gradually faded. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said with a friendly smile, "in just a few minutes we will invite a few family members to share brief toasts with the newly married couple." Applause followed the announcement, and several people turned toward the head table with bright anticipation. Wedding toasts are always emotional moments. They carry memories, gratitude, and sometimes gentle humor about the journey that brought two families together. I felt Margaret glance toward me, and I understood her silent question without her needing to ask it aloud. Toasts can shape the way a room understands a story. If Sabrina had already spent weeks planting a particular version of events, this would be the perfect stage to reinforce it. I placed my fork down carefully and folded my hands together once again. The band lowered their instruments while the wedding planner stepped down from the stage and approached the head table to coordinate the order of speakers. I could see Sabrina leaning toward her, speaking quietly, her expression composed and confident. Michael stood beside her, nodding occasionally as if agreeing to whatever plan had been arranged. Margaret leaned closer to me and spoke softly. "I would not be surprised if she plans to repeat her story in front of everyone," she said. I watched Sabrina accept a microphone from the planner a moment later, her posture straight, her smile bright under the chandelier light. The room grew quieter as guests turned their chairs slightly toward the stage area. "Perhaps," I replied calmly. Margaret studied my face again, noticing that my expression had not changed. "You do not seem worried," she observed. I allowed a slow breath to settle in my chest before answering. "Worry is useful only when it helps you prepare," I said quietly. The truth was that Richard had always believed important moments reveal the character of everyone in the room. Some people choose attention, others choose patience, and patience, when combined with facts, has a remarkable way of shifting the direction of a story. Sabrina stepped forward with the microphone, ready to speak to the entire ballroom. Guests leaned closer, eager to hear the words that would celebrate the beginning of Emma's marriage. As the room grew completely still, I looked around once more at the tables, the candles, the soft golden light across the floor. Everyone believed they were about to hear a simple wedding toast. What none of them understood yet was that this moment would determine whose version of the evening the room would remember. I watched Sabrina lift the microphone with the confidence of someone who believed the entire evening belonged to her. The ballroom grew quiet in that slow, collective way that happens when dozens of conversations fade at the same time. Glasses were set gently on tables, chairs turned slightly toward the front, and the soft music from the band stopped completely. The silence felt almost ceremonial, as if the room itself expected something meaningful to be said. Sabrina smiled warmly at the crowd before she began speaking. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers, smooth and practiced. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Emma and Daniel," she said. "This day means so much to our family." Polite applause followed her opening words. Emma beamed from the head table, reaching for her husband's hand, while several relatives dabbed at their eyes with folded napkins. For the first minute or two, the toast sounded exactly like any other wedding speech. Sabrina spoke about love, about family traditions, about how proud she was to welcome new beginnings into the Brooks family. She paused occasionally for laughter or applause, her timing precise and careful. Anyone listening without context would have believed she was simply offering a thoughtful tribute. Then her tone shifted slightly. It was subtle enough that some guests might not have noticed at first. "Weddings," she continued with a thoughtful smile, "bring together many different personalities, and sometimes that can make planning them a little complicated." A few people chuckled softly. Sabrina tilted her head slightly, as if remembering a difficult moment with patience and grace. "But Michael and I believed from the beginning that this day should belong entirely to Emma," she added. "We wanted to make sure everything reflected her dreams." She paused just long enough for the words to settle in the room. I felt Margaret shift beside me, her eyes moving briefly toward my face before returning to the stage. Sabrina continued speaking, her voice calm and confident. "There were moments during the planning process when it felt like we might not get there," she said. "Sometimes families disagree about how things should be done." Another small ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched quietly. Sabrina had chosen her phrasing carefully. Nothing she said could be considered openly disrespectful, yet the implication was clear to anyone who had heard her earlier remark. She was reinforcing the same story, but now she was doing it gently, disguised as reflection and gratitude. Michael stood beside her on the stage, nodding occasionally while keeping his smile fixed toward the audience. I wondered whether he realized how carefully each sentence had been designed. Sabrina lifted her glass then and looked toward Emma and her husband. "In the end," she said warmly, "love and determination made this evening possible. Michael and I are proud that we could help make Emma's wedding everything she hoped it would be." The guests responded with enthusiastic applause. Several people raised their glasses toward the head table, celebrating the sentiment. From where I sat, I could see Emma wiping a small tear from her cheek, clearly moved by the speech. Sabrina lowered the microphone slightly and waited for the applause to settle. Her eyes moved slowly across the ballroom, as if she were measuring the effect her words had created. When her gaze briefly passed over my table, her smile deepened just enough to reveal satisfaction. She believed the story had landed exactly the way she intended. Margaret leaned closer and whispered quietly, "That was deliberate." I nodded once without taking my eyes off the stage. "Yes," I replied softly. Across the room, Sabrina handed the microphone back to the wedding planner and stepped away from the stage, greeted immediately by several relatives who congratulated her on the speech. The room was buzzing again with admiration and approval. From the outside, it looked like a perfect toast. But as the applause faded and the music began again, I felt something inside me settle into place with complete clarity. Sabrina believed she had just finished telling the final version of the evening story. What she had not realized yet was that the evening still had room for one more voice. The applause that followed Sabrina's speech lingered for several seconds, rising and falling in warm waves across the ballroom. Guests lifted their glasses again, some leaning toward each other to compliment the speech they had just heard. The band began playing softly once more, a gentle piano melody that filled the room with an easy sense of celebration. From the outside, the evening had returned to its polished rhythm. But something had changed inside me while Sabrina spoke. It was not anger. It was clarity. I had spent most of my life believing that truth would eventually reveal itself without assistance, that patience alone was enough. Yet as I watched the room respond to the story she had carefully crafted, I realized something important. Silence allows a story to grow stronger, especially when that story is repeated with confidence. Margaret must have sensed the shift in my thoughts because she turned slightly toward me. "You are thinking about something," she said quietly. I looked toward the head table where Emma was laughing with her husband again, the moment of emotion from the toast already fading into the joyful energy of the evening. I wanted that happiness to remain untouched. "I am thinking about Richard," I answered softly. Margaret nodded at the mention of my husband's name. Richard had always believed that responsibility came with quiet strength. When he created the family trust years earlier, he insisted on one principle above all others. Important decisions should be handled calmly, with dignity, and at the right moment. The servers began clearing the dinner plates now, stacking dishes carefully while guests continued talking and enjoying the atmosphere. A few relatives approached the head table to congratulate Emma again, while others gathered near the dance floor in anticipation of the first dance. Sabrina stood among them, accepting compliments for her speech with a graceful smile. I could see how comfortable she felt in the admiration of the room. That confidence told me she believed the narrative she had built was secure. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate and rose slowly from my chair. Margaret looked up at me with quiet curiosity. "Helen," she asked gently, "what are you planning to do?" I smoothed the fabric of my dress and allowed myself a calm breath before answering. "Nothing dramatic," I said. "Just something honest." Margaret's eyes followed me as I stepped away from the table. The ballroom floor felt steady beneath my shoes as I walked toward the stage area. Conversations continued around me, most guests too engaged in their own discussions to notice where I was going. Near the stage, the wedding planner was speaking with one of the servers while adjusting a small stack of cue cards for the next part of the evening. When she saw me approach, she greeted me politely. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, "is everything all right?" I returned her smile and nodded once. "Yes," I replied. I was wondering if there might be time for a brief toast. She hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the head table where Sabrina was still surrounded by several guests. Then she nodded. "Of course," she said kindly. "It is always nice when family members wish to share something." She handed me the microphone with a warm, encouraging expression. I thanked her quietly and stepped onto the small stage beside the band. At first, only a few people noticed. The room was still alive with conversation and movement, but as I raised the microphone slightly, the band leader gave a subtle signal and the music softened again. One table at a time, the guests began turning their attention toward the stage. I could feel dozens of curious eyes settling on me. Sabrina noticed last. I saw her expression shift slightly as she realized who was standing at the microphone. The room grew quiet once more, the same expectant silence that had welcomed her speech only minutes earlier. I held the microphone comfortably in one hand and looked across the ballroom filled with friends, relatives, and the soft glow of candlelight. "Good evening," I began calmly, my voice carrying gently through the speakers. "I would like to say just a few words about how this beautiful evening came together." The room became completely still as my voice carried across the ballroom. For a moment, I simply stood there, allowing my eyes to move slowly from table to table. The candlelight reflected gently off the glassware and silver plates, and dozens of familiar faces looked back at me with quiet curiosity. Some guests smiled politely, expecting another short toast. Others looked slightly confused, perhaps remembering the tension from earlier in the evening. I rested one hand lightly on the edge of the microphone stand and continued speaking in the same calm tone. "First," I said, "I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate Emma and Daniel. Seeing so many friends and family members together in one room means more than you may realize." A few heads nodded around the room. Emma was watching me closely now from the head table, her expression a mixture of curiosity and affection. I smiled gently in her direction before continuing. "When Emma came to visit me 3 months ago," I said, "she brought a notebook full of ideas for this wedding. She sat at my kitchen table and described the garden ceremony, the music, the dinner, and the way she hoped everyone would feel surrounded by love." I paused for a moment as a soft murmur moved through the crowd. The memory was warm and real, and people could hear it in my voice. That afternoon she also told me that planning a wedding can be expensive. I continued. She was worried that the celebration she dreamed of might be more than she and Daniel could comfortably manage. Emma lowered her eyes slightly at the head table, smiling with a touch of embarrassment as the story unfolded. I remember telling her something very simple. I said gently. I told her that her grandfather Richard and I spent many years building a life so that when moments like this arrived, our family would never have to choose between joy and practicality. The room grew quieter with every sentence. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush my words. Each one moved slowly through the silence, carried by the microphone to every corner of the ballroom. Richard believed that family celebrations should never become a burden. I continued. He believed they should be gifts. And because of that belief, he created a family trust many years ago. I saw several relatives glance toward one another as they listened. Margaret sat at her table with a calm expression, watching the room the way Richard once had during important meetings. That trust, I said, exists for moments exactly like this one. Moments when a granddaughter begins a new chapter of her life, surrounded by the people who love her. I paused again and allowed a small smile to appear. So when Emma sat at my kitchen table that afternoon, I told her that the wedding she imagined would absolutely happen. Not because anyone needed recognition or credit, but because her grandfather had already prepared for it long ago. A quiet ripple of understanding moved across several tables. Guests began glancing toward the head table, then toward Sabrina and Michael. I kept my voice steady. The truth is very simple, I said calmly. The Brooks Family Trust has quietly taken care of nearly every expense for tonight's celebration. The flowers, the music, the dinner, and the beautiful ceremony you all witnessed earlier today were made possible by the love Richard placed into that trust for his family. No accusation followed the statement. I simply let the truth settle in the room the way candlelight settles into evening. I turned my eyes toward Emma and Daniel once more. Emma, I said softly, your grandfather would have been so proud to see you today. Emma's eyes filled with emotion as she squeezed her husband's hand. Around the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Guests who had applauded earlier now sat quietly, absorbing what they had just heard. After a moment, I lifted my glass slightly. Please join me in celebrating Emma and Daniel, I said warmly. May your life together always be guided by honesty, kindness, and the quiet strength that family is meant to provide. This time when the applause rose, it sounded different. Slower, deeper, and as I stepped down from the stage, I noticed that the story of the evening had changed without a single raised voice.